Imagine waking up one morning, right? And the small local community organization you manage has suddenly, inexplicably, inherited half of the known world. Like, you are now responsible for everything from Spain all the way to Persia.
It's just, it's the ultimate scaling problem. You're going from this very local regional council model to running a global, highly interconnected empire, essentially overnight.
Right, and the wealth is just pouring in faster than you can physically count it. But, you don't have a centralized treasury system, you definitely don't control the global reserve currency, and you don't have, like, an economics textbook to tell you how to manage it all.
Yeah, you are forced to write the rules of a global economy in real time,
Yeah.
just on the fly, with the survival of millions of people hanging in the balance.
Put yourself in that position. Today we are taking a deep dive into how the Umayyad dynasty, operating between 661 and 750 CE, had to basically invent global macroeconomic policy from scratch, just to prevent an overnight empire from instantly collapsing.
Exactly. And we're pulling from a really rich stack of sources today. Historical texts on early Islamic economic thought, academic papers detailing state administration, all to see how their economic thought wasn't this abstract theory, it was raw, applied public policy.
To really get the economics here, we have to grasp the massive political shift that had just occurred. The Umayyad era marks this huge transition from a spiritually focused leadership model into a hereditary kingdom, or a mulk, right?
Right, a mulk. And with their massive territorial expansion, you have this river of unprecedented wealth flowing directly into the state treasury, which is known as the Baitul Mal.
And the sheer volume of that wealth required a really diversified tax portfolio. Looking at the sources we're diving into today, they established several distinct revenue streams funneling into the Baitul Mal. The backbone of this seemed to be the Kharaj.
It was, yeah. The Kharaj was basically the agricultural land tax. It was a tax levied on the actual productive capacity of the soil itself, which, was incredibly vital for an agrarian empire. And then you had the Jizyah.
That's the protection tax paid by non-Muslim citizens, correct?
Yes, exactly. So in exchange for paying the Jizyah, non-Muslim populations received state protection and were completely exempt from military service.
Sure.
And beyond that, the state utilized the Khums.
Which took, what, 1/5 of the spoils of war?
Right, 1/5. Plus, for international trade, they instituted Usyur. You can think of Usyur as like modern import and customs duties.
Okay, so if a merchant crossed a provincial border or brought goods into the empire, they paid a tariff.
Yeah, that's Usyur. And finally, there was Fey, which was wealth, land, or resources acquired from territories that surrendered peacefully, so without an actual battle.
So they essentially built this comprehensive, multi-tiered tax system overnight. But I have a fundamental question about the intellectual history here, just looking at our sources.
Sure.
With all this money flooding into the Baitul Mal and all this new economic complexity, we don't see any grand, economic treatises being published. Where is the 7th century Adam Smith? Why didn't they write down theoretical economics textbooks?
Well, honestly, because theory requires a stable laboratory, and they were operating inside a burning building.
Wow, yeah. I guess they're a bit busy.
Very busy. They didn't have the luxury of academic reflection. They were actively integrating wildly different cultures, funding constant military campaigns, and managing these vast, unpredictable agrarian economies.
So the theory was just baked into the practice then?
Exactly. Their economic thought manifested directly as state legislation and institutional design. They figured out property rights and monetary policy by making real-time adjustments based on, well, whatever kept the empire stable and the supply chains moving.
But, getting the money is one thing. Knowing you have massive wealth recorded on a ledger means absolutely nothing if you can't securely move it across, 3,000 miles of territory.
Oh, the logistics were a nightmare.
Right. So how did they actually stop a courier from just riding off into the desert with the state's gold?
That was a critical vulnerability early on. Under the first Umayyad Caliph Muawiyah, payout orders from the Baitul Mal were simply written documents handed to couriers.
And couriers can read, I assume.
Oh, they definitely could. And they quickly realized they could just alter the numbers. They'd take an order for, say, 100,000 dirhams, forge an extra zero onto the document, hand it to the provincial treasury, and just pocket that massive difference.
So it's a basic counterfeiting and embezzlement problem, but how do you solve that without, digital encryption or two-factor authentication?
Well, Muawiyah essentially created an institutional physical encryption. It was called Diwan al-Khatam, the Bureau of the Seal. From then on, every single payout document was copied.
Okay.
The copy was securely filed away in a central state archive, and the original document was physically tied with thread and sealed with wax before being handed to the courier.
So if the courier arrives at the provincial treasury and the wax is broken, the order is completely void.
Precisely. And if the number somehow seemed suspicious, the provincial treasurer could just send a message back to the capital to verify it against the central archive.
It operates like an analog physical blockchain ledger, like a decentralized, verified record that stops embezzlement right in its tracks.
It really does. And that realization, that controlling the empire meant tightly controlling the flow of information that led to another major bureau, Diwan al-Barid.
The Postal Bureau, right?
Yeah, the Postal Service. Initially, this was just designed for military intelligence. They set up relay stations with fresh horses stationed at specific intervals all across the empire.
I understand how fresh horses help generals communicate troop movements, obviously, but the sources we have today cite this postal system as a massive economic driver. How does a military mail route actually integrate global markets?
Well, think about how markets price goods. One of the biggest hurdles in ancient trade was asymmetric information. That's when one party knows something the other doesn't.
Like a merchant in Damascus trying to price wheat, but they're completely unaware that a massive drought just hit Egypt?
Exactly. So by the time the news of that Egyptian drought reached Damascus months later, the market would panic, prices would skyrocket chaotically, and people would literally starve.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but Diwan al-Barid changed that dynamic entirely. By moving information rapidly across the empire, it drastically reduced that information asymmetry.
Because now merchants and state planners knew about price fluctuations or market scarcity or even the arrival times of trade caravans much, much faster.
Right. It effectively integrated these far-flung regional economies into a highly cohesive global market.
That's brilliant. I do want to challenge the long-term logic of some of their internal policies, though, based on the papers we're looking at.
Go for it.
So the sources talk about Muawiyah instituting a very controversial policy of fiscal centralization. He forced the outer provinces to pay for their own local expenses, like roads and soldiers, but he demanded that all surplus revenue, the fee we talked about, be shipped directly to the capital in Damascus.
Yeah, it was highly controversial.
That sounds incredibly short-sighted to me. Aren't you just asking for a rebellion by treating your outer provinces as, like, resource siphons for the capital?
Oh, it absolutely bred deep resentment in the provinces, which, spoiler alert, becomes a critical factor in their eventual downfall. But in the short term, centralizing that surplus allowed the state to act as a massive macroeconomic shock absorber.
How so?
By hoarding the surplus in the Baitul, the central government could intervene in regional economic crises on a scale that local governors could never, ever afford. The prime example of this mechanism in action is the 8th century governor of Iraq, al-Hajjaj bin Yusuf.
Yes. There's a historical account here in our sources that completely flips our modern assumptions about ancient governance. So Hajjaj is managing the Sawad, which is this incredibly fertile land in Iraq, basically the breadbasket for the empire.
The agricultural heartland, yeah.
Right. And a devastating agricultural crisis hits. A plague wipes out the cattle, crops fail entirely, and the farmers are left destitute.
Now, the standard imperial response at the time would be to send in the military, squeeze those starving farmers for whatever part of the agricultural tax they had left, and just let them starve.
Just abstract whatever value remains and move on.
Exactly. But Hajjaj is known historically as a notoriously ruthless military governor. Yet, he doesn't send in the troops to collect taxes.
Instead, he orchestrates a 2 million dirham emergency loan, a massive financial bailout injected directly from the central Baitul Mal. He gives this money to the farmers so they can buy new seeds, purchase new cattle, and repair their irrigation.
Yep.
What is the economic logic there? Why is a ruthless governor handing out state funds to failing farmers instead of just cutting his losses?
Because Hajjaj understood the mechanics of the supply chain. If you let those farmers collapse, the entire agricultural sector collapses. Food supply plummets, prices skyrocket, and famine sets in.
Right, which leads to riots.
Exactly. But worst of all for the state, the future tax base is permanently destroyed. Remember, the Kharaj is a tax on the productive capacity of the land. If the land isn't producing, the state goes bankrupt.
So it wasn't charity at all. It was early, counter-cyclical state intervention. He was making a calculated investment to stabilize commodity prices in the present while securing the flow of Kharaj revenue for the next decade.
It is brilliant supply chain protection. But, while they were mastering these internal macroeconomic crises, they were ignoring a massive external vulnerability.
Which was?
Up until the late 7th century, their money wasn't actually their own.
Oh, right. They didn't mint their own gold. The Islamic Empire was still largely relying on the coinage of the Byzantine and Persian empires for daily commerce.
Which sets the stage for a fascinating geopolitical currency war. So the Islamic Empire was exporting massive amounts of papyrus to the Byzantine Empire, which the Byzantines desperately needed for their own bureaucracy.
Right. And then Caliph Abdul Malik bin Marwan decides to flex his political muscle. Our sources show he orders that all exported papyrus must feature the Islamic phrase, La ilaha illallah.
Meaning, there is no God but God.
And the Byzantine emperor, Justinian II, is completely furious about this. He threatens a devastating economic counterattack.
A total nuclear option for the time.
Yeah. He sends a message to the caliph saying, essentially, if you don't remove that phrase from the papyrus, I am going to mint the gold currency, the very currency your entire empire relies on for daily trade, with deeply insulting slurs directed at the Prophet Muhammad.
It's an incredible strategic dilemma. Think about it. Do you crash your own economy by rejecting the world's reserve currency, completely paralyzing your global trade? Or do you bow to a foreign power and force your citizens to conduct their daily business using coins that deeply insult their faith?
That's wild. But Abdul Malik bin Marwan circumvents the threat entirely in 695 CE through a radical policy of monetary Arabization.
Yes, he does.
He founds Dar al-Sikkah, the official state mint, and he issues the very first purely Islamic currency, the Arabic gold dinar and the silver dirham. He essentially de-Romanizes the economy overnight.
The political victory there is obvious, but the macroeconomic precision of Dar al-Sikkah is what really matters here. First off, by minting their own currency, the state captured seigniorage.
Okay, meaning the profit the government makes from being the sole money printer, right? Like, if a coin's face value holds a certain amount of purchasing power, but the raw gold and the labor to mint it costs slightly less, the state pockets that difference.
Exactly. When you are the sole minter for a global empire, that is a massive self-sustaining revenue stream. Furthermore, they didn't just stamp a new logo on some metal. They established a rigid bimetallic standard known as the wazn Sab'ah.
Sab'ah.
Right. They strictly regulated the physical weight of the money.
Yeah.
So one dinar was standardized to exactly 4.25 grams of gold, and one dirham was exactly 2.975 grams of silver.
Which creates a locked-in ratio of 7 to 10. But, I mean, why does that strict weight ratio matter so much to the broader economy? If I'm a merchant treating silk in Spain, why do I care about a 7 to 10 weight ratio between silver and gold?
Because a fixed, standardized weight removes all the friction and guesswork from international trade. Before this standard, merchants had to constantly weigh and assay foreign coins to see how much actual gold was in them.
Because people would shave bits of gold off the edges, right?
Exactly, clipping and debasement. And that caused exchange rates to fluctuate wildly from city to city. By fixing the weight and strictly criminalizing the clipping or debasement of these coins, the Umayyads created a globally trusted standard.
So a dinar in Spain was worth the exact same as a dinar in India.
Yes, and that drastically reduced exchange rate volatility across their massive trade routes. They achieved true monetary sovereignty, and honestly, they made their currency the most reliable medium of exchange in the world at that time.
Wow. So they secure the agricultural supply chains, they capture monetary sovereignty, and wealth just explodes. But as our sources point out, whenever wealth scales this rapidly, it inevitably pools at the top.
Always.
The Umayyad elites started aggressively hoarding land and capital, which created a desperate need for structural social reform.
And that reform arrives with the ascension of Caliph Umar bin Abdul Aziz, who's widely known as Umar II. He surveys the state of the empire and recognizes that these systemic structural inequalities are just rotting the foundation of the state.
His first move is aggressive anti-oligarchy land reform. He targets the Koye. These were royal fiefs, massive tracts of highly productive land that had been illegally hoarded by wealthy elites and even members of his own royal family.
Right, he confiscates them and returns them directly to the public treasury.
It was a highly dangerous political move, though. He's attacking the wealth of his own power base.
Very dangerous. But Umar II was trying to fix a deeply broken system. And honestly, the most mathematically broken part of that system was the tax dilemma regarding the Mawali.
Let's break down the math on this because it highlights this incredible tension between ideology and economics. The Mawali were non-Arab citizens who had converted to Islam. Now, under Islamic law, once a person converts, they are no longer supposed to pay the Jizyah.
Because the Jizyah is a protection tax levied strictly on non-Muslims.
Right. But local governors, looking at their balance sheets, realized the massive sovereign debt crisis this created. If millions of farmers in the provinces convert to Islam just to avoid the tax burden, provincial revenues plummet.
Yeah, how does the governor pay his soldiers then? How does he maintain the aqueducts?
Exactly. So to keep the Baitul Mal full, they just kept charging the Mawali the Jizyah anyway, blatantly ignoring the law.
It is a direct, unavoidable clash between divine law and the state's balance sheet. So Umar Sakena steps into this crisis and famously declares Allah sent Muhammad as a guide, not a tax collector. And he immediately ends the discriminatory tax on the Mawali.
He willingly takes a massive short-term revenue hit.
He does. Because he understood that heavily taxing marginalized populations creates deep social instability. He prioritized human rights and fiscal justice over short-term state revenue. But, Umar II also knew that changing the law means absolutely nothing if the bureaucrats enforcing it are financially desperate and corruptible.
Which brings us to his policy of efficiency wages. He raises the salaries of public officials exponentially, up to 300 dinars.
It operates on the same logic as Henry Ford paying his auto workers $5 a day centuries later.
Right. It wasn't just charity. It was fundamentally changing the incentive structure of the system. Like, if you pay a bureaucrat enough to live a highly comfortable life, the risk of losing that lucrative job heavily outweighs the temptation of taking a bribe.
Exactly. And he paired that really high pay for public servants with strict austerity in his own royal court. He refused to live in luxury himself. Because of these structural reforms and just the sheer economic engine of the empire, the Baitul Mal continued to generate massive surpluses.
But instead of building giant monuments, Umar II redirected these funds into hyper-targeted social spending aimed at achieving basically zero poverty.
Yeah, the spending was revolutionary.
What did that actual spending look like on the ground, though, according to the papers?
So he used treasury funds to pay off the debts of the Arimen.
The Agrarian.
Yeah, citizens who were trapped in crushing, inescapable debt. He just paid it off.
Yeah.
He also provided state-funded marriage subsidies so young people could afford to start families. And he heavily utilized Karthul Lasan.
Which are benevolent loans, right?
Yes, benevolent interest-free loans provided directly by the state to citizens in need of capital to either start businesses or recover from disasters.
It functions almost like a utopian welfare state operating at the height of the 8th century. It's incredible. But human nature being what it is, how long did this actually last? What happens when Umar II is gone and the oligarchs want their Kali lands and their lavish lifestyles back?
Well, it didn't last long at all. Post-Umar II rulers faced immense pressure from those elites. Very quickly, the state reverted to an authoritarian, highly extractive economic regime.
But why break a working system? I mean, they saw that Hajjaj's agricultural bailouts stabilized the food supply. They saw that Umar II's social equity stabilized the populace. Why abandon policies that mathematically worked?
Because extractive policies are incredibly profitable in the short term for the people at the very top. If we look at the systemic causes of the Umayyad collapse based on the research, they basically made 3 fatal economic errors that undid all their previous brilliance. First, they reimposed that discriminatory Jizyah tax on the Mawali.
So reintroducing highly regressive taxation on their most vulnerable citizens.
Yep. Second, they intensified spatial economic extraction. So they aggressively drained resources from the outer provinces, the periphery, solely to fund the lavish capital in Damascus. They stopped investing in local provincial infrastructure and simply extracted from it.
Basically treating the outer empire as a resource colony to feed the center.
Precisely. And third, because these extractive policies made the populace incredibly angry, the state had to engage in excessive, constant military spending just to maintain domestic control. Funding an endless internal police state led to severe structural deficits.
So let me get this straight. They tax the poorest citizens, drain the provinces to fund the capital, and then spend all their money paying soldiers to suppress the riots caused by those first 2 policies.
That's the cycle.
It is a textbook recipe for an economic death spiral.
And that economic injustice led directly to the dynasty's collapse. Those marginalized Mawali populations, furious over their economic exploitation, formed the militant backbone of the Abbasid revolution. In 750 CE, They completely overthrew the Umayyad dynasty.
Synthesizing this entire historical journey,
Yeah.
it is just wild. We watched an empire manage explosive overnight wealth by inventing analog blockchain audits and using postal routes to integrate global markets.
Yep.
We saw them win a geopolitical currency war by establishing strict bimetallic standards. And we saw them briefly achieve structural equity and zero poverty under Umar II, only to completely collapse because elite greed and regressive taxation rotted the system from the inside out.
The macroeconomic lesson here is just undeniable. An economy cannot survive on macro-level wealth and a strong currency alone. If a state fails at fiscal justice, if it extracts too much wealth from its periphery to feed the center, it will inevitably collapse from within. Strong borders and stablecoins cannot save a society that operates on systemic economic injustice.
That is such a powerful takeaway for you to ponder. Think about how modern governments react when facing severe economic crises today. Do they prioritize long-term fiscal justice, stabilizing the incentive structures and bailing out the working class like Umar II? Or do they default to extractive, short-term revenue grabs, protecting the center at the expense of the periphery?
It's a question we still haven't fully answered.
Right. Look at modern tax policies, the structure of our corporate bailouts, and the widening wealth gaps in our world today. Ask yourself, are we learning the macroeconomic lessons of the 8th century, or are we just repeating the cycle of 750 CE? You can't sustain a skyscraper if you're constantly excavating its foundation just to paint the roof. Eventually, the whole thing comes down.